I, 29M, had just finished another long day at work when I got a message that nearly knocked me off balance. It was from my parents, the ones who hadn't spoken to me in over 5 years, since they'd essentially cut me off from the family for pursuing my own business. They wanted to meet. Not just for a casual "how have you been" catch-up, but because they had a request, one that didn't even involve me directly. They wanted me to help my brother, Scott, 31M, the same brother who's always been the golden child, the apple of their eye, the one who could do no wrong. If I was the family disappointment, Scott was the shining star. He excelled in school, got into a top-tier college, and landed a prestigious job right after graduation. 5 years ago, he became the youngest VP in his company's history. I remember how my parents bragged endlessly about it, how proud they were, how they looked at me and said, "Why can't you be more like Scott?" Growing up, I'd been compared to him in every way. Every academic achievement of his was celebrated, while my efforts barely got a nod. Even after I graduated and got a decent job, they never let me forget that Scott was the one making history. It didn't matter that I wasn't interested in corporate life, or that I'd always dreamed of being an entrepreneur. My ambitions didn't fit their mold of success. So when I finally decided to quit my job and start my own business, modern and custom-designed car accessories, I hoped that, despite everything, they'd at least be happy I was doing something I loved. I couldn't have been more wrong. The day I told them about my business plans, they laughed in my face. I still remember the sting of their words, the way they looked at me like I was some foolish kid playing dress-up. "You're serious?" my dad asked, shaking his head. "This is your big idea? After all those years in school, you want to waste it on some car gadgets?" I tried to explain that I'd done my research, that there was a market for it, that I had investors lined up and a solid business model. But all they could see was failure. "Stick to your job," they told me. "Don't embarrass yourself. Don't embarrass us." That's when I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. They didn't believe in me. They never had. And that wasn't going to change no matter what I did. I cut ties, walked away from them, from Scott, from the whole toxic family dynamic. I started my business without their support, without their blessings. It was rough, rougher than I'd imagined. For a while, I was living on nothing but ramen and adrenaline, working 18-hour days just to keep things afloat. But then, things started to turn around. A big client took a chance on me, word of mouth spread, and before I knew it, my little company was taking off. 5 years later, I'm not a millionaire, but I'm doing pretty damn well. I have a comfortable apartment, a nice car, a solid business, and a wonderful wife, Emma. We got married 2 years ago, and just last month we found out we're expecting our first child. It's everything I'd ever wanted, and none of it involved my parents or their approval. But then, out of nowhere, they reached out. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd changed. Maybe they wanted to make amends, but no. It was all about Scott. Apparently, his company had gone through some rough times, and there were mass layoffs. Even the upper management wasn't spared, and Scott was left jobless for the first time in his life. My parents painted a picture of him being lost, depressed, not knowing what to do with himself after having dedicated so much of his identity to that company. And they were worried. Not just worried. They were desperate. They wanted me to hire him. I couldn't believe it. 5 years of silence, of being completely cut off, and the first time they reach out, it's to ask for a favor. For Scott. "Just give him a position," they pleaded. "Something that pays well. Something where he won't have to start from scratch. He's struggling, Ben. He needs this." For a moment, I couldn't even process what they were asking, the audacity of it. They'd practically disowned me when I started my own business, told me I was going to be a failure. Now they wanted me to rescue Scott? To put him in a cushy job just because he'd hit a rough patch? "I'll think about it," I said, just to buy myself some time. I didn't want to make a scene right then and there, but I knew what my answer was going to be. When I got home, I told Emma everything. She listened quietly, her expression calm but serious. "You don't owe them anything," she said softly. "If you don't want to do this, don't. They've never supported you, never believed in you. You don't have to play savior just because they're panicking now." I nodded, grateful for her support. I knew she was right, but it still felt strange. This was my brother, the one I'd grown up with, even if we'd never been close. I didn't want to see him suffer, but I also didn't want to let my parents use me, manipulate me into bailing them out when they'd never shown me an ounce of support. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. I spent days wrestling with the decision, going back and forth in my head. Part of me wanted to say yes, just to prove that I wasn't the selfish, petty son they'd always made me out to be. But another part, the part that remembered every insult, every dismissal, every time they'd put Scott on a pedestal while tearing me down, knew that I couldn't do it. Not like this I called my parents. I told them that I'd thought about it and that I wasn't going to hire Scott. I kept my voice calm, even as my heart pounded in my chest. I explained that our relationship wasn't strong enough for us to work together, that I didn't think it would be a good fit for either of us. They exploded. They screamed at me, accusing me of being heartless, of holding on to old grudges, of abandoning family when they needed me most. "We raised you," my dad shouted. "We gave you everything, and now, when your brother needs help, you're just going to turn your back on him? You didn't give me everything," I snapped, my voice shaking. "You gave Scott everything. You made it clear that he was the one who mattered, not me, and now you want me to clean up your mess because it's convenient for you? No, I'm not doing it." "Fine," my mom spat. "If that's how you want it, then fine. But don't expect us to be there when you need us. Don't expect us to forgive you for this." "Forgive me?" I laughed bitterly. "You haven't spoken to me in 5 years. I don't need your forgiveness." And with that, I hung up. I blocked their numbers, deleted their emails, and told Emma that I didn't want to hear another word about them. I felt a strange mix of anger and relief, like a weight had been lifted off my chest, even as a new one settled in its place. Had I done the right thing? Should I have just sucked it up and helped Scott out, just to keep the peace? But no. I knew in my gut that I'd made the right choice. For once, I wasn't going to let them control me. I wasn't going to let them twist my life to suit their needs. If they wanted to be part of my life again, they'd have to do it on my terms. And I had a feeling that wasn't something they'd ever be willing to accept. For a few days after I hung up on my parents, things were quiet. Too quiet. I was bracing myself for some kind of backlash, waiting for them to try something else. But the silence dragged on, and I almost let myself believe that they'd finally given up. Of course, I should have known better. It started with a few random messages from relatives, distant cousins, an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years. They wanted to know if I was okay, if I'd thought things through with my family. Some of them sounded genuinely concerned, but others had a tone that made my skin crawl. It was the same condescending pity I'd gotten from my parents for years, the kind of tone that said, "Poor Ben, always making things harder on himself." But I brushed it off. They didn't know what was really going on. They hadn't been there for the countless times I'd been overlooked, belittled, made to feel like I was worthless. I wasn't going to let them guilt-trip me now. Then the calls started. Emma and I had kept my parents blocked, but they must have been desperate because they found another way to harass us, through my wife's family. Her parents, her cousins, even a few old family friends were suddenly getting calls from my mom and dad trying to explain the situation. I didn't know the details at first, but I could guess the narrative they were spinning. How I'd abandoned my brother in his time of need, how I was being stubborn, holding on to childish grudges. They probably painted Scott as the innocent victim, struggling after an unexpected layoff, and me as the selfish, ungrateful son who refused to help. It wasn't until Emma's father, Mr. Thompson, called me that I found out just how far they were willing to go. "Ben, your parents just contacted us," he said, his voice tight. "They're telling us some interesting stories." I rubbed my temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache forming. "What did they say?" "They said you're cutting them out of your life for no reason, that you're refusing to let them see their grandchild." "What?" I nearly dropped my phone. "I haven't even told them about the baby. How could they?" "They're assuming, Ben," Mr. Thompson said gently. "They're making up their own story because you won't give them one." I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my anger. "What else did they say?" "They were persuasive," he admitted. "Said it's our job as your wife's family to mediate, to make sure you see reason and come back to them." I laughed bitterly. It was exactly what I should have expected. Manipulation, guilt, pressure from people they thought I'd actually listen to. "I'm sorry they dragged you into this," I said quietly. "I didn't think they'd go that far." "It's not your fault," he said firmly. "But you need to understand something. They're not going to stop. Not until they get what they want, and they're using the baby to do it." The words sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought about it like that, hadn't realized just how twisted this whole thing was. But Mr. Thompson was right. My parents weren't just trying to guilt me into helping Scott. They were trying to control me, to worm their way back into my life by using my unborn child as leverage. And I wasn't going to let them. "I'm not letting them anywhere near Emma or the baby," I said firmly. "I don't care what they say. I don't care what they threaten. They lost their chance when they cut me off." "Good," he said softly. "You're doing the right thing. Just keep your guard up, okay? They might try to take this to a whole new level." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, I will." And I did. I made sure that every possible point of contact was locked down. No more phone numbers, no more emails, no more relatives who could act as go-betweens. If they wanted to reach me, they'd have to find a way to get through a wall of silence. But just when I thought I'd finally taken control of the situation, I got the email. It came from an anonymous address, one I didn't recognize. But the subject line made my heart drop. "Your child will suffer." My hands shook as I clicked it open. It was short, just a few lines, but every word felt like a punch to the gut. "You think you can keep us away? You think you can deprive us of our family? Your child will pay for your selfishness. They'll grow up without grandparents because of your stubbornness. You're a terrible father already." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as anger and fear warred in my chest. I knew who it was. Of course I knew. There was no one else who would stoop so low, who would send something like this just to hurt me. My parents. They'd always been manipulative, always willing to play dirty to get what they wanted. But this was a whole new level of cruelty. I didn't tell Emma about the email. She was still in the early stages of her pregnancy, and I didn't want to stress her out. But I couldn't just let this slide either. I needed to confront them, to make it clear that they were never, ever going to get away with threatening my family. So I went to their house. It felt surreal, standing outside the same door I'd walked through countless times as a kid. But this time, everything was different. I wasn't the scared little boy trying to earn their approval. I was a father-to-be, a man who had built his own life without them, and I was done playing by their rules. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knew they were home. Their cars were in the driveway, and I could hear voices inside. But they were ignoring me. "Cowards! Mom, Dad!" I shouted, pounding on the door again. "Open up! I know you're in there!" The voices went silent. "Fine," I snarled. "If you want to hide, go ahead, but I'm not leaving until you listen to what I have to say." Still nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "You have no right," I said, my voice shaking. "No right to send me that email. No right to say those things about my child. You think you can bully me into giving in, but it's not going to work. You're just pushing me further away." Silence. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding. "I'm done, okay? Done with all of this. If you ever want to be part of my life again, you have to start by apologizing. Not just for the email, but for everything. For cutting me off. For choosing Scott over me. For treating me like I didn't matter. Until you do that, I want nothing to do with you." Still, no response. "I mean it," I said, my voice rising. "Don't think you can worm your way back in by playing the victim. I'm not falling for it. If you keep this up, you'll lose me for good, and you'll never meet your grandchild either." With that, I turned and walked away, my heart aching. I wanted them to chase after me, to open the door and apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But I knew that would never happen. They were too proud, too stubborn, too convinced that they were in the right. When I got home, Emma could tell something was wrong. But I just smiled and kissed her, promising that everything was fine. "We're going to be okay," I whispered, holding her close. "We don't need them. We never did." And for the first time, I started to believe it. A few days later, we announced the pregnancy on social media. It was a simple post, A picture of us holding a tiny pair of baby shoes with the caption, "Coming soon, Baby Smith, arriving in the spring." The response was overwhelming. Friends, family, even distant acquaintances flooded us with congratulations and love. But there, buried among the dozens of comments, was a single malicious post. "Congratulations. I hope your child grows up knowing what family loyalty really means." The account was a fake. No profile picture, no posts, just a few words designed to cut deep. I deleted the comment and blocked the account, but it didn't stop the sick feeling in my stomach. They were watching, waiting, and I had no idea what they would do next. But I knew one thing for sure. I was done letting them control me. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one. Because now, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for my family. The fake account comments stopped, and things went quiet again for a while. But I knew better than to think it was over. My parents weren't the type to just let go. They'd tried guilt, manipulation, and even threats, but I hadn't caved. Now I was waiting for their next move, bracing myself for whatever they were going to throw at me next. It didn't take long. One morning, I got a call from Scott. I hadn't spoken to him since this whole mess started, and honestly, I'd hoped I wouldn't have to. But seeing his name flash on my screen made my heart sink. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to just pretend I hadn't seen it. But something told me this was important. So, reluctantly, I picked up. "Hey, Scott," I said cautiously. "What's up?" "Ben," he replied, his voice low and tired. "We need to talk." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "About what?" "About everything," he sighed. I'm sorry, man. I didn't know what Mom and Dad were saying to you. I just found out. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Sorry? Scott was apologizing? What the hell was going on? What are you talking about? I asked slowly. He hesitated, and I could hear him swallow hard. "I didn't know they were pushing you to hire me. I didn't ask them to do that. I didn't even know they were in contact with you. I thought you'd cut everyone off." I blinked, confusion mixing with disbelief. "So wait, you didn't ask them to reach out to me?" "No," he exclaimed, sounding almost desperate. "I would never. Ben, I've been depressed, yeah, but I'm not that desperate. I don't want to work for you. I didn't want to drag you into this mess." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what he was saying. So it hadn't been Scott pushing them to pressure me. It had been my parents acting on their own, trying to rope me into helping him without his knowledge. "Then why the hell didn't you say something?" I demanded. "Why didn't you stop them?" "Because I didn't know," he snapped, frustration clear in his voice. I've been dealing with my own stuff, okay? I wasn't talking to them much, just trying to get my head straight. I only found out when a couple of our relatives started reaching out, saying I shouldn't thank you for offering to help." I snorted, shaking my head. "Offering, yeah, right." "Ben, I'm sorry," Scott said quietly. "I know we've never been close, but I never wanted this. I never wanted you to feel like I was using you." Something in his voice caught my attention. For the first time in years, Scott sounded genuine, vulnerable, like he actually cared about how I felt, about the mess our parents had made. I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a real conversation, one where we weren't just sniping at each other or competing for our parents' approval. "It's not just about the job," I muttered. "It's about everything. All the years of being compared to you, of being told I'd never be good enough. And now, the minute you're struggling, they want me to be the one to fix it. It's not fair, Scott." "I know," he murmured. "I know it's not. And I'm sorry I didn't see it before. I was so caught up in trying to be perfect for them that I didn't realize what it was doing to you. I thought, God, I don't even know what I thought." We both fell silent, the weight of years of resentment and misunderstanding hanging between us. I'd spent my whole life resenting Scott, thinking he was the reason our parents had never seen me as good enough. But listening to him now, I realized something. He'd been trapped too. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked softly. Because I've lost everything," he said quietly. "My job, my sense of purpose. And now I'm losing our family too. Mom and Dad are so focused on controlling everything, they can't even see what they're doing to us, and I'm done." It was like a punch to the gut, Scott, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, was done with our parents. I'd never thought I'd hear those words from him. "So what now?" I asked, my voice tight. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said firmly. I want to start over, Ben, with you. No parents, no expectations, no comparisons, just brothers." I stared at the wall, my mind racing. Could I do that? Could I put aside years of resentment and try to build a relationship with Scott? Did I even want to? I don't know, I admitted honestly. It's going to take time, Scott. I can't just flip a switch and pretend everything's fine." "I know," he said softly. "I'm not asking for a miracle, just a chance, please." I took a deep breath, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to say no, to cut him off along with our parents and never look back. But another part, a small, tentative part, was curious. What would it be like to have a brother, a real brother, without all the baggage? "Okay," I said slowly. "Let's see what happens." It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Scott and I started talking more. It wasn't easy. There were a lot of awkward pauses, a lot of stumbling over old hurts and buried anger. But gradually we found a rhythm. He told me more about his struggles, about the pressure he'd felt to always live up to our parents' expectations. And I told him about my business, about the early days when I'd been so close to giving up. We shared stories, traded memories, and little by little the walls between us started to crumble. Meanwhile, my parents went ballistic. When Scott told them he didn't want anything to do with their schemes, that he wanted to rebuild his relationship with me on his own terms. They lost it. They screamed at him, accused him of betraying them, of throwing away everything they'd done for him. They even went as far as to say that he'd been poisoned by me, that I was turning him against them out of spite. But Scott didn't back down. He stood his ground and told them that if they couldn't respect his decisions, they'd lose him, too. So, of course, they blamed me. They started a smear campaign, telling everyone who would listen that I'd brainwashed Scott, that I was trying to destroy our family. They painted me as some bitter, vengeful son who was trying to tear apart what little unity we had left. I couldn't believe it. Even when faced with losing both of their sons, they still refused to take responsibility. But this time they'd pushed too far. Our relatives, the same ones they'd tried to turn against me, finally started pushing back. They knew our history, knew how I'd been treated, and they weren't buying my parents' lies anymore. One by one, they called them out, told them to stop trying to manipulate the situation. Some even went so far as to cut ties with them entirely. For the first time, my parents were the ones facing rejection. They'd spent so long using people, controlling people, that they didn't know how to handle it when those people turned their backs. It should have felt like a victory. But mostly, it just felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. That they were so blinded by their own need for control that they'd driven away the very people who should have been their support system. Scott and I kept our distance from the drama. We focused on building our own relationship, ignoring the noise coming from our parents' corner. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from their expectations, from their manipulation, from the constant need to prove myself. When Emma finally gave birth to our son, Scott was one of the first people I called. He showed up at the hospital with flowers and a small stuffed bear, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. "Congratulations," he said softly, his smile genuine. "You're going to be a great dad, Ben." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw not my rival, not the golden child, but just my brother. "Thanks, Scott," I said quietly. "That means a lot." And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened with our parents, no matter how much they tried to tear us apart, we were going to be okay. Because we were finally family. On our terms.